G'day everyone and welcome back to representing numbers to 1,000. Now in this video we're going to be looking at problem solving. So we know that we have developed over the last few videos our skills all about representing numbers to 1,000. So we've done some representing using number lines, we've done some sequencing, we've done some finding the missing numbers, and we've used the language of between, more or less. So in this video we're going to add all that all together and we are going to solve a problem. Now you will notice in this screen here you can see looks like a bit like a clock, and there are two of them. This thing here is called a pedometer and they read how many steps that you do. So in this one here we can see that this person here has done 942 steps. This one here has done 634 steps. So let's go and solve a problem together about using representing numbers to 1,000. So over here we can see a page with a whole bunch of these pedometers down the bottom here. And the question or the task says, the Year 2 staff measured the amount of steps they took in a day. These are their records. So down the bottom here we have Mr. Graham, and how many has he done? He has done 530 steps. Mr. Quinn is here. How many steps has Mr. Quinn done? 560. Excellent. Miss Marinon, 550. Miss Kriegish, 500. And Mrs. Burr, 590. So we are going to use this information down the bottom to put these in the correct sequence. So we know that each of them start with the 5. Okay? Our job is to work out which one came first, second, third, fourth, fifth. And we're going to plot them onto our number line. Let's go ahead and do that. Is look at the data from over here and put that onto the number line. So what do you think is the first person and what did they get? Which of the teachers would go first on the number line? Who got the least amount of steps? Mrs. Krieger, she got 500. Who got the next one? What comes next after Mrs. Krieger? Who got the next amount of steps? 530. Good. And that is Mr. Graham. I shouldn't have scribbled on that. I'll get rid of that scribble. Nope, looks like I can't get rid of it. Yep, there we go. Get rid of that scribble. Now we have Mr. Graham who got 530. Absolutely. Let's go ahead and plot that onto our timeline. Who had the next amount? Who came next? Who got the next amount of steps? 530. Excellent. Let's go and put, 550. Miss Marinon, let's go put. Okay, so we have, the next two are Mr. Quinn and Mrs. Burr. So Mr. Quinn had 560 steps. Mrs. Burr had 590 steps. So who would come next after Miss Marinon, do you think? Absolutely spot on. It is Mr. Quinn because he is 550, 560. So we'll put Mr. Quinn at 560, and then after Mr. Quinn at 560 is Mrs. Burr at 590. These numbers on the bottom here weren't in the correct order. We had 530, 560, 550, 500, and 590. They need to be. So the task says put each result onto the number line. Our number line is down the bottom here. Now, what are each of these lines counting? We looked at that in our Understanding 2 video. Are they counting in ones or are they counting in tens, do you think? They are counting in tens, absolutely. If we look at the last two numbers, we have 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So they are increasing in lots of 10. So each of those lines represent 10. Our job now is to put the data, and let's look at where Mrs. Kriegish would go. Who can find the number 500 here? Absolutely. So I'm going to write here. I'm going to shorten it and I'm going to put Mrs. and I'll put K. That represents Mrs. Kriegish. Now, the next one we have, who can go? So who can find where 530 is? Just here, excellent. And I'll put Mr. and I'll put a G for Mr. Graham. Okay, so we have Mrs. Kriegish at 500 steps, Mr. Graham at 530 steps, and we'll put Miss and an M for Miss Marinon. Now we'll do the next two together now. So I'll put Mr. and I'll put a Q for Quinn at 560, and then all the way down the bottom here at 590, I'll put Mrs. and I'll put a B for Burr. So the first thing we have done then is we have labelled and correctly sequenced all of the results onto the number line. Okay, so Mrs. Kriegish had 500 steps and we put her down the bottom here. Next came Mr. Graham at 530 steps. Who came next? Miss Marinon, absolutely, at 550. Mr. Quinn at 560 steps. And all the way at the end here is Mrs. Burr at 590 steps. The first question here asked, who took the least amount of steps? Who took the least amount of steps here? Who took the least amount, do you think? So we're looking here at the number that is the least, not the most. What is the least number here with someone's name attached to it? Down the bottom here, Mrs. Kriegish, absolutely. It's on the far left side of the number line, therefore it's the least. So we can put here Mrs. and we'll put a K. Okay? The next said, who had the most amount of steps? The most. So if Mrs. Kriegish had the least, who do you think would have the most? We need to be looking at this end of the number line, the right side of the number line, because the numbers are getting bigger. And Mrs. Burr has the most amount of steps. So we'll put Mrs. and we'll put a B just so we don't write the whole one. So it says here, who had more steps than Mr. Quinn? So find for me Mr. Quinn or Mr. Q on the number line. There we go. Who had more steps than Mr. Quinn? Which person had more steps than Mr. Quinn? More means we're going to the right. We're getting more steps, so we're going increasing the value. And we look over here and we got Mrs. Burr again. So she's the correct answer for two questions here, Mrs. B. And the next question asks, who had made less steps than Mr. Graham? So Mr. Graham here down here made 530. Who made less steps than Mr. Graham? Not more, less. So Mr. Graham made 530, so we're looking for a number that's less than 530. Who made less steps than 530? We're looking to our left, and we can see Mrs. Kriegish, and how many did she make? 500. So I'll put Mrs. K here. Mr. Graham hasn't been very adventurous on who made it. We have Mrs. Kriegish, Mrs. Burr, and then Mrs. Kriegish again. Now, next question asked, who got between Mrs. Burr and Miss Marinon? So, Mrs. Burr is here at 590. Miss Marinon is here at 550. Who got between Miss Marinon and Mrs. Burr? Which person got between? Can you see a teacher's name that is between Miss Marinon and Mrs. Burr? Who would that be? Mr. Quinn. Absolutely. Now, the important thing about when we have done this problem solving is that we needed to make sure that each of the teachers' named were in the correct order. So on the timeline for you to be able to answer the question. So when you go ahead and do your practice task, the first thing you need to do is make sure that your numbers are correctly sequenced on the number line. Go ahead now and do your problem solving activity. Well done, and thank you for listening.